Okay, I'm going to try and make this as fast as possible because I'm the odd man out. I'm the only person presenting, kind of more formally. But I did want to actually take a moment and discuss a couple of things because I'm coming from a bit of a different perspective, and I came to MyData and the white paper in 2015 from a very different perspective. I work in the field of higher education in the United States. In particular, for about 12 years, I worked at a small liberal arts college in Virginia called the University of Mary Washington, which very few people have probably heard of, but it was kind of an interesting space, and I want to talk about why. This black box we're looking at behind me is what we call in the US, the acronym we use is called the Learning Management System. In Britain, they use the idea of the virtual learning environment, and this is basically an environment where students basically do work for universities. They comment on other people's forum data, they upload images. Content they're doing throughout their university is usually stored in something like a learning management system. Well, it's kind of a pretty ugly system, designed in 1999. It hasn't really made too many jumps forward. It's files all the way down. And in 2004, 2005, a group at University of Mary Washington, very small group, basically said, why are we using these learning management systems where not only are we putting all our data in them, but we're getting very little data out. We can't take our work that we do at universities with us. Now, Brian Willard brought up the point yesterday, and it was a good one, like, well, do you really want to keep that data? Are you interested in those comments on that forum? And that's a very good question. And I would say probably most students would say no. But at the same time, 2004, 2005, when I started at Mary Washington, we had a revolution of open source software that was accessible, and anyone with a web hosting account could basically install their own WordPress, MediaWiki, which runs Wikipedia, etc. And universities started to explore with this. We were early on. We went very much with the open source application called WordPress, which I'll talk about in a bit. And what we built in 2006 was one of the earlier WordPress multi-sites, which means every student at University of Mary Washington and faculty could build and design their own blog, as they called it in 2006, 2007, which really we've come to learn as a website, and do what they like with it. Build out their portfolio, design a course site, create a research site. So we had this kind of diverse access and ecosystem of content that wasn't just a description. More than that, WordPress was an interesting application because it allowed us to export and import from various different applications online using XML, right? Using an open standard. So this became a kind of new model for some universities to think about how students live and share and control their data online. Our idea was based very much in Virginia Woolf's notion of a room of one's own. How do we give students at University of Mary Washington a domain of one's own? A space online where they control and manage their work over the course of not only their career, but beyond. So we kind of did some Spider-Man 1970s aesthetics around it, and we got funding from our university. And what we did is rather than just giving people a subdomain of umwblogs.org, we said, get your own domain. And people did. And what's interesting about this is a student's website from 2013. And we started this in it was a long journey from 2004 to 2012 when we were able to do this. But this is an art student's website. Now, this is on WordPress, and this is a pretty straight up portfolio. But if I click on this now, one of the interesting points for me is Sidney Mullis was a grad student at Penn State University, but her site's totally different. But all of her work that was on her university site remains consistent in there. I don't know what CMS she's using or content management system, but what I do know is that the domain in many ways defines her space and her identity and her kind of professional presence as an artist. And so as universities, one of the things I was thinking about more and more is how important is that portability of the namespace, independent of the technology that it's pointing to. And I don't think that's something we think about when we think very specifically about data portability. Now, I'm going to go back to my slide because I did go to the open web during this, which I know is crazy, but I live a crazy life. You can see university professors using this very realistic ways. This is a very interesting course about the Chinese Civil War. And it's a civil war very few people know about. Millions of people died during this war. And this is a course-generated open resource used through a professor's domain on WordPress. They're using various technologies. And this is a question that I think raised, I could talk about this course, I won't, I don't want to spend too much time, although this course is all using RSS and syndication for it, because every student who was part of this course got their own domain. And all of their assignments were actually filtered into what might be considered an assignment bank, where they could judge, do other people's assignments, basically using RSS as the syndication to glue the entire class together. Well, we know what happened. RSS kind of died. I don't know if we want to blame Google Reader for dying as part of that, but I think RSS was always dying. And we were replaced with APIs. We hear a lot about APIs during this conference. And my interest here, and this is kind of where I'll stop, is in my sector, higher ed, in the US at least, I can't speak for Europe or beyond, there's this new thing called the Next Generation Digital Learning Environment, NGDLE. We're horrible with acronyms, it only gets worse. But what is interesting about this system is it's kind of vaporware. It's an imagined system by this group called EDUCAUSE, and it has all the questions and interests we share, I think, as a group at MyData. But one of the things that it's really not considering or thinking about is where students can control, manage, export their own data. The Next Generation Digital Learning Environment, in many ways, is the learning management system, or the VLE, with third-party corporate tentacles within the system to grab and frame that student data. Now, the GDPR kind of hit us in the US adjacently, right? It kind of hit us, but we're not under its rule. But one of the big things for me when I came to MyData was this is something that completely inverts the way right now we're thinking about how students should and can control their data in higher ed. Domain of One's Own is an outlier project. It's kind of an independent, experiment. But when I read this white paper in 2015, it seemed to me the polar opposite of what we were talking about when we were talking about the Next Generation Digital Learning Environment, which is basically Apple Store for students. And it has no kind of sense of where that student's data lives and all the work they've done, right? So with that, I'll basically talk about the final piece, which is what does it mean, and this is something that Brigham Young University and some other universities are working at, because from UMW, I started a hosting company which works with about 80 universities who are giving students and faculty their own domain. And one of the things that comes out of this idea, which I think really puts us in line with what MyData is talking about, is what was a personal API look like? What would it be if students and faculty could control and share their data along the lines of some of the questions that Sovereign's asking in relationship to the work they've done and the data they have over time? And the biggest question, and this is where I'll end, is how are we as universities in the US, but I think beyond, educating students and faculty about questions of portability, about the idea that you can take one content from one application and move it seamlessly to another, as was shown with the data transfer project, which is fascinating, but even take that from an application like Flickr or Google Photos and bring it into your own domain and have control over it more locally. So those are the larger questions. With that, I'll stop and I'll pass it back to Robert.
Well, Jim, please stay there just to answer a couple of questions.